Did Canon lie? Did Canon lie about the fact that the R5 can overheat, but does it need to? Welcome to my channel. Today we're going to talk about the R5 and Canon's philosophy on these firmware updates that affected this camera. Now we're going to tackle this subject in a couple of ways. We're going to look at it as if they did lie, what did they do when it comes to this firmware? If they didn't lie, then what is it they really probably did in the release of this firmware? And then, of course, we'll end it on my thoughts on what I actually believe they really did. If you don't know, the R5 was an incredible camera that was released July 30th, 2020, and it could do several amazing things. One of those things be it the 8K video that it could do. And Canon advertised that 8K video was one of the primary reasons why you'd want to pick it up. But then just slightly before release, they started dropping hints that this camera will overheat. To Canon's credit, they quickly came up with a firmware update that actually used the ambient temperature around the camera to kind of counteract the quick overheating that it used to have when it initially launched. But since then, anything addressing the overheating has been scarce, if existent at all. Now, a number of people have found workarounds with the camera. Some safe, like having the camera in a cooler temperature and putting a fan next to it or a fan on it. And some not so safe, such as playing with the battery just to reset the timer. For a couple of years, that's just the reality of how Canon R5 users had to use the camera. Until recently. You see, I'm outside right now. It's 83 degrees. I'm sitting in the shade, but this camera filmed a couple of things before I'm recording this video in 8K RAW. The time limit, 30 minutes. I mean, Canon's got to get rid of that 30-minute time limit, but other than that, it's pretty much letting me record what I want, as long as I want, without worrying about overheating. But back then, it was a different story. Back then, you had to do whatever you needed to do. But then with this most recent firmware update, you no longer worry about overheating with this camera for a long time in basically all of the recording modes. So what gives? Did Canon know that they could do this from the beginning? Or was this something to just sell more cameras like the R5C, because the R5C is basically an R5 with a fan? I mean, what gives? So let's look at the worst case scenario that Canon might have done. So a lot of people speculate, and I've heard this, Canon purposely crippled this camera, the R5, because they knew that they wanted to sell a cinema mirrorless camera hybrid with the R5C. Now the R5C, like I said before, is basically an R5 with a fan, but with the firmware of the cinema series and the recording modes and the ability to record 8K at 60 frames per second, albeit you gotta connect a spare battery. All these features that users might not have cared about if they already had an R5 that can record. So Canon thought, let's see, since we want them to buy the R5C and we already released the R5, let's just make it so that the R5 can't record without limits and go from there. So that strategy worked, maybe, if that was their intent, because R5C basically sold most of its stock, and a lot of people actually do like the R5C for all of its video-centric features. And a lot of people like the R5 for its photo-centric features. Now I never switched from the R5 because the R5 gave me video that I needed when I needed it, and of course if I wanted to record 8K or 4K 120, the amount that I would record was always sufficient and within its heating limits. It probably overheated on me on one project where I wish I could have used more, but that's it. And I was okay with that because I had a plan for it. So that's Canon if they had the worst intentions. Now what do I think about that? Well, that kind of stinks, but I also think of it in a way that they didn't have to release this firmware update, firmware 1.6, that completely removed the overheating scenario. So yeah, it sucks for profitability, but I'm also happy that they unlocked it, which they didn't have to do. Now, what if Canon had the best intentions? What are the best intentions? How could you say that Canon had the best intentions and then did what they did? Well, let's think about it from a hardware perspective. Canon released the R5 and immediately got backlash for the overheating, something that everybody complained about. Now, Canon had just released the camera and they did test for it so that it wouldn't break or melt on you when you record these higher resolution modes that at the time no other camera was giving it. So they do that. They see the overheating backlash. They quickly adjust a firmware update because honestly I think that they screwed up on the software. On the first firmware that didn't use ambient temperature. It just basically had a timer for each of the modes, which was quite unfair. So let's say, okay, they realized that, but then it took them this long to release the firmware 1.6, removing the overheating. That's based on the fact that I believe that because they had time to test the camera and make sure that it doesn't melt over a couple of years, they were able to do that without having to worry about the actual camera melting on them. You see, when it comes to manufacturing and production, one of the most annoying and expensive things for a company to do is recall a product. When you recall, there are a lot of expenses, there's a lot of downside, unfortunately, and if you had this feature unlocked from the get-go without Canon testing it for a couple of years, you better believe that a number of people with melted cameras would be sending their cameras back, and Canon would have to recall the R5 to shut off that feature or make sure that it can't be implemented. Why? Because that would break the camera. And that's what they wanted to test. A number of years they had to run these tests. Why? Because sure, you can test it and it doesn't melt after 4 or 5 tries, and I've seen several people test the overheating situation on the 1.6 firmware on the R5 and they're like, oh, it doesn't overheat, and the camera would last, so I don't see any problems. But you don't know what type of damage would happen with the camera without time, without doing that over and over again for a number of days, months, or years, which is what Canon did. Again, this is my assumption scenario. So by testing it for a couple years and with many cameras and seeing that the camera still ran fine, that memory cards were not melting, the ones that they tested and approved, and everything was just working as is given those higher temperatures, you better believe that, okay, now they have 2 years. Not a bad life cycle for a camera. I think we could release it in a firmware update. And they did. And now we have the camera successfully running 8K, 4K 120, 4K 60, 4K HQ without the overheating situation. And then people are going to complain and say, you lied. But in my scenario 1, they did. So what do I believe happened? I believe it's a combination of the two. I believe that Canon knew the overheating limitations that they were going to have on this camera, and they were scared, so they put that temperature, that overheating timer, and to turn off the camera on purpose because, again, they did not want to have a problem, especially with a recall. But when it came to fixing it, the timing of it was pretty peculiar and particular because they released it after the R5C had already sold in. And they knew that, okay, we have time, we've got this other camera, let's give it the time that it needs to fix the problem. See, I don't think that they had the solution to the problem right away. I still think it needed time. But they also knew from a business perspective that they probably should take the time both for profitability and to be careful with the camera. But at the end of the day, my feeling is that Canon did not have to remove the overheating limit. Canon's doing a number of other things that make this camera kind of annoying, such as the 30-minute time limit, which is completely ridiculous. Those are things that they could fix, but they're not going to because they're protecting, I guess, their cinema line, or they're protecting their ability to sell newer cameras, such as the R7 and the R10 and the R3. So it's like, oh, I want no time limit, let me buy that camera. So it's not protecting just the cinema line, it's protecting other cameras that you might want to buy just so that you can have a few of these extra basic features. But the overheating thing itself was something that was probably hurting them from a business perspective because of the Sony a7S III, for example, doesn't overheat much with 4K 120. And that in itself, I mean, if you look at any video, most, at least people on YouTube, are using Sony cameras. A lot of events that I'm going to, especially like weddings, they're using Sony cameras. Canon doesn't want to lose that. They're kind of throwing stuff in that we wish we could have. So now when you take an R5 and you record a wedding, you don't have to worry about the 4K 60 overheating on you, 4K 120 when you want those slow motion shots, or even 8K for that extra detail that you're looking for. It's all there, and it won't stop on you. which is so crucial. But now that like wedding videographers have the ability to record without worry in higher resolution and higher quality, 8K RAW without needing to attach an Atomos with no recording overheating limit, why wouldn't you take the R5? Well, because the files are a little bit difficult to work with in post. Well, if you've got a good enough setup, then you don't need to worry about that. But you can get great quality, great Canon colors, great raw files like you would want without worrying about what we used to worry about. That's it. It's just this ability to be able to record and use our cameras professionally. And now, don't even have to consider an R5C, because I don't really need 8K 60 that much. Occasionally I do, but I don't really need it that much for my video shoots. There you go. Anyway, let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. Did Canon lie, or were they trying to be honest, or was it a gray area in the middle? Let me know in the comments down below what your opinion is. And as always, like, share, and you can make my day if you subscribe today. This is Magnus, and I'm out. See you guys later.